I thought such betrayals only existed in movies until I found my fiancé holding my sister's hands. The real shock was my family's rehearsed speech, demanding I disappear. 5 years later, with my sister comatose and their dirty secrets imploding, they want me back. Not out of love, but because I am the only one who can save them. I am not returning for family. I am returning to decide who loses everything. My name is Quinn Mitchell, and by the time I reached my 29th birthday, I had engineered a life constructed entirely of deliberate, meticulously calculated choices. As the director of operations at Halcyon Structures, an ascending green infrastructure design firm here in Portland, my daily existence revolved around mitigating risks, foreseeing structural failures, and ensuring that foundations were poured exactly to specifications. My job was to look at a blueprint and immediately identify where the weak points were, where the earth might give way, where the steel might buckle under pressure. I applied that exact same rigorous, unforgiving methodology to my personal life. I absolutely refused to leave anything to chance. Just 2 months prior, I had closed on my first townhouse. I paid the down payment entirely with my own savings, utilizing money I had painstakingly accumulated through 70-hour work weeks and relentless financial discipline. Walking through those empty, echoey rooms on the day I got the keys, running my hand over the cool quartz countertops and inspecting the flawless crown molding, I felt a profound sense of security. I had built a fortress of my own making. It was a quiet, orderly life, where every single object had a designated place, and every variable was safely under my control. The absolute crown jewel of this carefully curated existence was my fiancé, Avery Sloan. Avery was an interior designer with an eye for the delicate, the soft, and the refined. She possessed this rare, quiet gravity that drew people to her without her ever having to raise her voice. When she walked into a crowded room, she did not demand attention, yet she effortlessly convinced everyone present that she was the absolute kindest, most empathetic soul they would ever have the privilege of speaking to. Her gentleness felt like a necessary soothing balm, a perfect antidote to the abrasive, hard-edged world of contractors, permits, and concrete that I navigated every single day. Our wedding was exactly 6 weeks away. Every single vendor deposit had been paid in full, with the receipts neatly filed in my home office. The invitations, printed on heavy cream cardstock with elegantly embossed gold lettering, had been mailed out over a month ago. For the very first time in my entire life, my parents looked at me with something resembling genuine pride. At our engagement party last spring, my mother had clinked her crystal champagne flute against mine and loudly proclaimed to her circle of friends how relieved she was that I was finally settling down. She had smiled, patted my arm, and remarked that I was always so much more stable, so much more predictable than my older sister. That sister was Sabrina Mitchell. At 33 years old, Sabrina was a high-powered commercial lawyer, a woman who treated every room she entered like a grand courtroom where she was simultaneously the presiding judge, the jury, and the executioner. She was razor-sharp, devastatingly glamorous, and a master manipulator of the highest order. In the grand, ongoing theater production of our family dynamic, Sabrina was the undisputed, untouchable star. It did not matter one bit that her personal life was a spectacular, perpetual disaster zone filled with broken relationships and financial close calls. From the time we were little girls, our roles within the family ecosystem were rigidly defined and strictly enforced. I was the designated fixer. I was the one who quietly paid off the honor debts, who cleaned up the literal and metaphorical messes, who swallowed my pride and kept my mouth tightly shut just to maintain a fragile, artificial peace in our household. Sabrina, on the other hand, was the hurricane. She would absolutely wreck a situation, shatter people's boundaries, destroy carefully laid plans, and then simply step over the resulting debris with a dazzling, entirely unbothered smile. My parents never held her accountable for the destruction she left in her wake. They simply excused her chaos as the necessary, unavoidable byproduct of her brilliance and charisma. I had spent my entire adult life building heavy firewalls to to keep Sabrina's toxic chaos far away from my meticulously ordered existence. With Avery, I genuinely believed I had finally found a completely safe harbor. Avery had always been remarkably vocal about her disdain for people who operated like Sabrina. She found vanity repulsive and empty. She often remarked, while we were lying in bed after a family dinner, how utterly exhausting it was to be around someone who constantly needed to be the absolute center of attention, someone who relentlessly sucked all the oxygen out of every room they walked into. Avery told me she valued peace, authenticity, and quiet, steady intimacy above all else. Sabrina was the walking, talking antithesis of all those things. Therefore, the thought that my older sister could ever be a legitimate threat to my relationship never even registered as a microscopic possibility in my logical mind. It was a blind spot the size of a massive crater, born of pure, foolish arrogance and a desperate desire to believe that I had finally won something Sabrina could not take. That comforting illusion shattered completely on an otherwise unremarkable Wednesday evening. I was sitting at my desk in the office, reviewing a complex quarterly budget projection for a new waterfront project, when my phone vibrated loudly against the glass. It was my mother calling. Her voice, which usually vibrated with a sort of frantic, neurotic energy regarding wedding details, was completely flat and devoid of emotion. She asked me to come over to the family house immediately to finalize a few last-minute details for the rehearsal dinner. On the surface, the request was entirely logical and mundane. We were just 6 weeks out. Final logistics needed addressing. Head counts needed confirming. But there was a chilling, sterile quality to her tone that made the tiny hairs on the back of my neck stand at immediate attention. It was far too calm. It was the forced, measured, deeply unnatural cadence of someone reading directly from a prepared script during a hostage situation. I packed up my briefcase and drove across town, the steady, rhythmic swishing of the windshield wipers doing absolutely nothing to soothe the sudden, inexplicable knot tightening painfully in my stomach. When I finally pulled my car into the familiar paved driveway, I noticed the house was unnervingly dark, saved only for the harsh overhead lights illuminating the kitchen and the softer lamps in the living room. I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped inside the foyer. The air inside felt impossibly heavy, suffocatingly still, like the atmospheric drop right before a violent thunderstorm. My father was standing alone in the kitchen, leaning heavily against the marble island. He did not look up to greet me. He just stared down at the polished stone surface with a hollow, vacant expression, looking exactly like an exhausted man who had just stood by and watched his own house burn to the ground. I immediately noticed that my younger teenage cousin, who reliably stayed with them every Wednesday night for algebra tutoring, was nowhere to be seen. She had clearly been sent home early to clear the stage. Then my eyes drifted to the long wooden dining table. 3 cell phones were placed side by side, perfectly aligned, all resting face down on the polished wood. It did not look like the messy aftermath of a warm family gathering. It looked like a staged corporate intervention. It looked exactly like a carefully orchestrated ambush. My pulse began to hammer violently against my ribs, a slow, sickening drumbeat that drowned out all other sound. I walked slowly past the dining room, my low heels clicking far too loudly against the silent hardwood floor, and stepped down into the sunken living room. Time simply stopped moving. The scene arranged before me etched itself violently into my retinas with the harsh, unforgiving, blinding clarity of a crime scene photograph. Avery was sitting on the center cushion of the antique velvet sofa, my beautiful, gentle, deeply empathetic fiancée. But she was not sitting alone. She was pressed right up against Sabrina's side. The physical proximity alone was jarring enough to make me stop breathing. But it was their hands that made the blood freeze solid in my veins. Avery and Sabrina had their fingers tightly, desperately intertwined, forming a knot of flesh resting securely on Avery's lap. They were clinging to each other with a fierce intensity, huddled together as if I were the dangerous intruder, as if I were the cruel villain violently barging into the middle of their tragic, star-crossed love story. I stood completely paralyzed by the doorway, the heavy silence in the room stretching and pulling until it felt like it would snap and take my entire sanity with it. Avery cowardly refused to look me in the eye. Her gaze remained fixed firmly on the intricate patterns of the Persian rug, a single, dramatic tear slipping slowly down her perfectly contoured cheek. Sabrina, however, did not look away. She lifted her chin and met my stare head-on. There was absolutely no shame in her dark eyes, no trace of guilt or remorse, only a cold, defiant, deeply familiar challenge. And then, from the far corner of my peripheral vision, I registered a slight movement. My mother was sitting stiffly in the wingback armchair adjacent to the sofa. She was not looking at me with any sort of maternal concern, warmth, or even pity. Her posture was completely rigid, her expression strictly businesslike, as if she were about to chair a hostile board meeting. Clutched tightly to her chest, her knuckles turning white from the immense strain of her grip, was a thick manila folder. Even from several feet away, I recognized the distinct blue and gray logo stamped boldly on the front cover. It was from the specialized fertility and women's health clinic Avery and I had visited just 2 months ago to begin our family planning. It was a thick stack of official medical test results. The hardwood floor beneath my feet did not literally open up to swallow me, but the profound, nauseating sensation of falling, of absolute, catastrophic freefall into a black void, was exactly identical. The perfectly constructed, meticulously maintained walls of my quiet life were rapidly collapsing all around me, and the people holding the heavy sledgehammers were the exact ones I had trusted the most. The heavy silence in the living room stretched until it became a physical weight pressing painfully against my chest. No one moved, no one breathed. Then, my mother broke the stillness. Her voice was perfectly modulated, pitched in that soothing, highly reasonable tone she typically reserved for negotiating with difficult service workers or calming down irate clients. "Quinn," she began, her hands smoothly pressing out an invisible wrinkle on her tailored skirt. "You need to hear everything before you react." It was the single most cruel sentence a parent could possibly deliver in that exact moment. It was a strict command to suppress my own basic humanity, an outright instruction to absorb a fatal, life-altering blow without daring to bleed on her pristine, perfectly vacuumed carpets. Right next to my sister, Avery let out a soft, shuddering gasp. Tears immediately spilled over her lower eyelashes, tracing wet, glistening paths down her carefully moisturized face. But watching her cry, my hyper-analytical mind coldly registered the exact nature of those tears. She was not weeping out of a profound, gut-wrenching realization that she had just decimated my entire existence. No, she was crying the exact way a guilty child cries when they have willfully broken an expensive antique vase and desperately want to be comforted and forgiven before the actual punishment arrives. She wanted absolute absolution. She wanted me to look at her, soften my posture, and tell her that we could somehow fix it. I did not look at her. I shifted my gaze directly to Sabrina. My sister did not flinch in the slightest. She sat entirely upright, her shoulders perfectly squared, her expression a brilliant masterclass in composed, unyielding defiance. She did not offer a frantic apology or a tearful, remorseful confession. Instead, she spoke with the smooth, detached, highly calculated cadence of a corporate litigator presenting an opening statement to a judge. "Avery and I have had a connection for a long time," Sabrina stated smoothly, her fingers tightening slightly, possessively, around Avery's hand. "We tried to ignore it. We really did try. But some things are just inevitable. Quinn, it is an unfortunate situation. I know, but it is the truth." An unfortunate situation. She delivered the catastrophic revelation of her betrayal as if it were a minor scheduling conflict, a slightly inconvenient logistical error that we simply needed to manage together. The absolute staggering audacity of her phrasing made my peripheral vision blur at the edges. A connection. While I was spending hours reviewing catering contracts and agonizing over the seating chart for our reception, they were actively cultivating a connection right behind my back. I opened my mouth to speak, to scream, to demand a coherent explanation, but my vocal cords felt completely paralyzed, frozen by the sheer magnitude of the shock. Before I could force a single, coherent syllable past my lips, my mother leaned forward from her wingback chair. She lifted the thick manila folder from her lap and placed it deliberately on the glass coffee table between us. The harsh overhead lighting caught the crisp, clinical emblem of the specialized fertility center printed on the cover. "Avery is 12 weeks pregnant," my mother said, her tone entirely devoid of any emotional inflection whatsoever. The words hung in the suffocating air, completely disjointed and surreal. 12 weeks. My brain, meticulously trained to constantly crunch data sets and analyze project timelines, immediately went into absolute overdrive. 12 weeks meant exactly 3 months. 3 months ago, Avery and I had been sitting side by side in the plush, sterile consultation office of that exact medical clinic. We had mapped out our entire future together. We were going to start the in vitro fertilization process immediately upon returning from our honeymoon. We had spent countless late evenings huddled together over my laptop on our sofa, meticulously combing through detailed donor profiles. We had intensely debated medical histories, educational backgrounds, and inherent personality traits. We had finally settled on a specific donor, paid the deposit using thousands of dollars directly from my own hard-earned savings account, and signed the extensive preliminary legal agreements. I stared down at the terrifying folder, then shifted my eyes to Avery's slightly trembling hands, and a horrifying, monstrous realization began to crystallize rapidly in my mind. The math, the timeline, the clinic. "You use the donor," I whispered, my voice sounding incredibly brittle and hollow, like dry dead leaves crushing heavily under a boot. "The one we picked out together. The exact one I paid to reserve for us." Avery squeezed her eyes tightly shut, letting out another pathetic, trembling sob that shook her narrow shoulders. "Sabrina said," she choked out, her voice barely audible over the roaring sound of blood rushing in my ears. "Sabrina told me that we did not need to wait. She said that this child belonged to my real future, our real future. She said you would be far too focused on your demanding career anyway to truly appreciate a baby right now." The remaining oxygen completely vanished from the room. The betrayal had suddenly mutated from a mundane, ugly, everyday affair into something profoundly sinister and monstrous. They had not just slept together behind my back in a moment of weak passion. They had actively, systematically conspired to steal the precise, meticulously designed blueprint of my future family. They had taken the exact child I had dreamed of, the specific genetic profile I had researched and chosen, and they had created that life entirely without me. Sabrina had not just stolen my romantic partner. She had ruthlessly colonized the very dream of motherhood I had painstakingly planned out step by step. She had maliciously convinced Avery that my disciplined nature, the very trait that provided Avery with the financial and emotional safety she always claimed to crave, made me an unfit parent compared to their chaotic, impulsive romance. I turned my head slowly, stiffly, toward the open doorway of the kitchen. My father was standing at the edge of the room now, his hands shoved deep into his trouser pockets. He was the man who had taught me how to balance a ledger, the man who had always loudly praised my unfailing logic. I waited for him to step forward, to finally act like a parent, to express massive outrage, to throw them both out of his house for what they had deliberately done to his youngest daughter. Instead, he cleared his throat nervously and looked at a blank spot on the wall somewhere just above my left shoulder. "Look, Quinn," he muttered, his voice weak, cowardly, and completely avoiding my eyes. "This is an incredibly complex situation. No one wanted anyone to get hurt here, but there is a baby involved now. A tiny, innocent child is coming into this world very soon. We all have to look at the bigger picture. The family has to prioritize the baby." I stared at him, physically feeling the last remaining threads of my familial bonds snapping violently. One by one, a complex situation. That was his official verdict. A calculated, deliberate, psychological slaughter of his own daughter was immediately reduced to a complex situation simply because Sabrina was the one holding the bloody knife. I turned slowly back to my mother, the silent, calculating architect of this entire ambush. She sat there with her hands folded neatly in her lap, looking at me with an expression of stoic, immovable expectation. She actually expected me to nod. She expected me to swallow the bitter bile rising in my throat, to logically process this new reality, and to figure out how to calmly manage the resulting public relations fallout for the family. "And what about me?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, deadly quiet. The question was not a pathetic plea for their sympathy, it was a test. It was the final, definitive test of whether I had ever actually belonged in this family as a human being, rather than a utility. My mother looked me dead in the eye. She did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. She did not soften her hard gaze. She delivered the final, fatal blow with absolute, terrifying precision. "You are strong enough to get through this, Quinn," she said, her voice chillingly calm and entirely pragmatic. "Sabrina is not. You have your thriving career, your new house, your total independence. You will be absolutely fine. But your sister desperately needs this. Avery needs this. If we do not step up and support them now, Sabrina will completely fall apart." Everything inside me froze completely solid. The warm blood in my veins instantly turned to ice. In that single, horrifying sentence, my mother had laid bare the entire twisted, sickening mechanism of our family dynamic. My strength, my resilience, my consistent ability to survive without ever being a burden had not earned me their respect or their fierce protection. It had simply marked me as utterly expendable. Because I could survive the excruciating pain, I was officially nominated to bear it. Because Sabrina was weak, reckless, and perpetually fragile. She was gleefully awarded the grand prize of my entire life just to keep her from breaking. I did not scream. I did not flip the heavy glass coffee table across the room, although the violent urge to do so vibrated intensely in my hands. Panic and rage are messy emotions strictly reserved for people who foolishly believe things can still be salvaged. I knew, with absolute, terrifying clarity, that there was absolutely nothing left here to save. The structural integrity had failed completely. The foundation was utterly rotten to the core. I slowly reached over with my right hand and grasped the platinum engagement ring resting on my left ring finger. The expensive diamond caught the harsh overhead light as I slid it off over my knuckle. The metal felt foreign, heavy, and completely dead. I leaned forward and placed the ring gently, deliberately, right on top of the fertility clinic folder. It made a sharp, definitive tap against the paper. I stood up, pulled my shoulders back, and smoothed the front of my trousers. I looked down at Avery, who was cowardly hiding her face in Sabrina's shoulder. I looked at Sabrina, whose triumphant, arrogant smirk was now barely concealed behind a thin mask of false concern. I looked at my father, who was still pathetically staring at the blank wall. Finally, I looked directly at my mother. "Listen to me very carefully," I said, my voice completely steady, entirely stripped of all warmth and all hesitation. "From this exact minute forward, I am done. I am not the collateral damage for your complex situations. I am not the shock absorber for her endless mistakes." I pointed a rigid, unforgiving finger directly at Sabrina. "If any of you choose to stand with them tonight, if you choose to justify this grotesque betrayal, then you are simultaneously choosing to lose me completely. There will be absolutely no holidays, no phone calls, no emergency favors, and no second chances. I will be dead to you, and you will be completely dead to me." No one spoke a single word. The silence that followed was not the tense, electric silence of an impending argument. It was the heavy, suffocating, permanent silence of a heavy vault door being sealed shut forever. My mother simply tightened her lips into a thin line, effectively casting her final vote. I turned around and walked straight out of the living room. I did not run. I walked with the measured, deliberate, unstoppable steps of someone leaving a condemned building just seconds before the demolition charges detonate. I opened the heavy oak front door, stepped out into the damp, cold Portland night, and let the door slam firmly shut behind me, securely locking them all inside the miserable, treacherous world they had chosen over me. I drove back to the townhouse that was supposed to represent the unshakable foundation of my adult life. I did not bother turning on the main overhead lights when I walked through the heavy front door. The pale, ambient glow from the street lamps bleeding through the expensive wooden blinds provided more than enough illumination for what I needed to execute. I pulled 3 large, hard-shell suitcases from the deep hall closet and began the systematic process of dismantling my entire physical presence in that space. I moved with absolute mechanical efficiency, completely devoid of tears or hesitation. I packed my tailored work clothes, my essential personal documents, and my favorite hardback books. I deliberately left behind the expensive mid-century modern furniture I had painstakingly selected, measured, and paid for with my own money. They were just inanimate objects now, heavy and utterly meaningless, permanently anchored to a sinking ghost ship. As I moved silently from room to room through the shadowy house, the actual physical footprint of the intrusion revealed itself to me in sickening, entirely mundane details. I found a vibrant, incredibly expensive silk scarf draped casually over the back of the reading chair in the spare bedroom. It was definitely not Avery's understated style. It was loud, ostentatious, and reeked faintly of my sister's signature heavy jasmine perfume. In the kitchen, a ceramic mug stained with dark red lipstick sat unapologetically in the stainless steel sink, as if the person who drank from it owned the plumbing. When I opened the 3rd drawer down next to the oven to grab my spare phone charger, my knuckles brushed against a pair of oversized, designer tortoiseshell sunglasses. My sister had not simply orchestrated a conceptual betrayal from afar. She had been getting dangerously, physically comfortable in my private sanctuary, treating my fiercely protected home like her own personal waiting room. I left her items sitting exactly where they were by dawn. I was sitting in my car in the driveway with the engine running, watching the sun crest over the Portland skyline one last time. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, I placed a call to the exclusive vineyard estate we had booked for the wedding ceremony. I formally and permanently canceled the reservation. The venue coordinator regretfully informed me, her voice dripping with practiced professional sympathy, that I would automatically forfeit my massive, non-refundable deposit of $15,000. I told her to keep every single cent. I viewed that heavy financial loss not as an unfair penalty, but as the necessary, completely justified ransom required to successfully buy back my total freedom from a rotting existence. Within 3 weeks, the townhouse was completely sold. I priced the property aggressively below market value to guarantee a rapid, all-cash closing. I handed the heavy brass keys over to an anonymous corporate buyer without feeling a single, solitary ounce of sentimentality. During those 21 days of transition, my phone screen lit up incessantly with incoming notifications. There were frantic voicemails from my former fiancé, lengthy, manipulative text messages from my mother, and emails from mutual friends who possessed the sheer audacity to suggest I should at least sit down and hear both sides of the story. I did not listen to a single syllable. I executed a ruthless, uncompromising digital purge. I permanently blocked every single family member, erased every shared contact, and deleted all my social media profiles. I became a ghost by choice. The hardest professional conversation of my entire career happened on a rainy Tuesday morning. I walked straight into my regional manager's office at Halcyon Structures and handed him a brief, legally binding letter of resignation. My boss was visibly stunned. He leaned across his massive mahogany desk, frantically reminding me that I was currently on a direct, highly accelerated track for a lucrative executive vice president role within the next 12 months. I politely thanked him for his invaluable mentorship and his unwavering belief in my capabilities, but I firmly stated that I could not stay. I absolutely refused to continue building green infrastructure in a city where every single street corner, every artisanal coffee shop, and every suspension bridge was violently infected with the memories of people who had conspired to destroy me. I packed the trunk of my car and drove eastward for days until the landscape and the weather changed completely, finally dropping anchor in the sprawling, unforgiving grid of Chicago. I secured a new position at North Spire Civic, a highly ambitious, rapidly expanding urban development consultancy firm. I willingly accepted a job title that was a solid 2 steps lower than my previous director role, along with a rather significant annual pay cut. I did not care about the professional optics or the temporary loss of prestige. What I successfully purchased with that voluntary demotion was total mental autonomy and a brilliantly clean slate. The first 2 years in the Midwest were a grueling exercise in brutal, systematic psychological reconstruction. I attended rigorous cognitive behavioral therapy twice a week without fail. I did not pay a professional to sit on a plush couch and teach me how to cry about forgiveness, nor did I seek passive strategies to somehow empathize with my family's pathological cruelty. Forgiveness is a convenient concept invented primarily to make guilty bystanders feel comfortable. My therapy was strictly tactical and aggressively defensive. I worked relentlessly to ensure that their profound betrayal did not calcify into my core identity. I absolutely refused to let the deep humiliation of being replaced become the permanent lens through which I viewed the rest of my natural life. I completely overhauled my daily rhythm to leave zero room for idle, destructive thoughts. I ran 5 miles along the freezing, wind-whipped lakefront every single morning at exactly 5 o'clock, letting the biting cold harden my resolve. I spent my quiet evenings intensely studying advanced corporate finance, real estate law, and urban policy, stacking new, highly marketable skills like heavy bricks in a defensive fortress. I dated occasionally during this period, but I kept everyone at a highly calculated, heavily monitored distance. I never drank too much wine at dinners. I never stayed the night at anyone else's apartment, and I absolutely never shared the agonizing, humiliating details of my past. To the people I interacted with in Chicago, Quinn Mitchell was simply a driven, fiercely private professional who had relocated for a fresh start. By the time my 4th year in the city arrived, my unrelenting strategy of total detachment and supreme competence had paid off exponentially. My laser focus propelled me rapidly up the corporate ladder at North Spire Civic. I was officially promoted to the Director of Strategic Projects, a position that commanded a base salary and bonus structure that far exceeded the inflated, boastful numbers my sister used to parade around the dining room table. I purchased a sprawling, ultra-modern apartment with floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooking the icy, dark waters of the Chicago River. I had successfully engineered a deeply satisfying, incredibly luxurious life that required absolutely zero validation, zero approval, and zero input from the people who shared my DNA. It was during this specific era of absolute ironclad stability that I began dating Noelle Hart. She was a senior investigative data journalist working for a major, highly respected independent publication. Noelle was not loud, flashy, or desperate for the spotlight. She possessed a terrifyingly calm, intensely observant demeanor that immediately commanded respect. Her entire professional career was built entirely on her uncanny, almost surgical ability to stare at massive, convoluted data sets and spot the microscopic loopholes, the hidden financial discrepancies, and the deeply buried truths that powerful people desperately tried to conceal. Our relationship developed with a slow, deliberate cadence that felt incredibly safe to my heavily guarded nervous system. Noelle never demanded grand, performative declarations of eternal love, and she never pushed me to aggressively expose the locked vaults of my history before I was fully ready to open the door. She simply observed my strict routines, noted my fiercely guarded boundaries, and respected them implicitly without taking my distance as a personal insult. When I finally decided to tell her the clinical, unvarnished facts of exactly why I had packed up and left Portland, she did not offer empty, useless platitudes or unwanted, suffocating pity. She simply sat quietly on my leather sofa, processed the information with the cool efficiency of a complex data model, and poured me another glass of expensive red wine. With Noelle, there were absolutely no hidden agendas, No chaotic emotional landmines waiting to be stepped on, and zero blind spots. I had successfully insulated myself in a completely new world, a high-altitude fortress built of cold logic, hard truths, and absolute self-reliance, existing far beyond the poisonous reach of the people who had confidently expected me to shatter. The timeline marked exactly 5 years since the night I packed my life into 3 suitcases and drove away from the Pacific Northwest. It was a quiet, unassuming Sunday evening in late October. Outside the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my Chicago apartment, the wind was whipping up a freezing rain over the dark river. But inside, the atmosphere was a fortress of warmth and absolute domestic tranquility. Noelle and I were standing side by side at the kitchen island. She was meticulously chopping fresh herbs with the focused precision of a surgeon, while I was tending to a cast-iron skillet, searing a heavy cut of salmon. Jazz was playing softly from the wireless speaker. Everything was entirely predictable, safe, and perfectly anchored in the present. Then, my cell phone vibrated sharply against the marble countertop. I glanced down. The illuminated screen displayed an unsaved number, but the area code was a sharp, jagged piece of glass from my past. It was a Portland prefix. I had spent half a decade ruthlessly ignoring, blocking, and erasing any digital footprint that dared to follow me from that city. A rational part of my brain commanded me to swipe left, to send the call immediately to the digital void where the rest of my former life resided. But Noelle stopped chopping. She looked at the screen, then looked up at me. Her dark eyes, trained to spot anomalies, recognized the sudden, rigid shift in my posture. I reached out, my fingers inexplicably cold, and pressed the green button to accept the call. I brought the phone to my ear, but remained entirely silent, forcing the caller to declare themselves first. The silence on the line stretched tight. A heavy, suffocating wire pulled taut between 2 distant time zones. When the voice finally broke through the static, it did not possess the sharp, aristocratic, commanding polish I had spent my entire childhood learning to fear and obey. It was my mother. Her tone was completely unrecognizable. It was dangerously thin, severely hoarse, and trembling with a frantic, barely suppressed panic. She sounded exactly like a woman desperately trying to hold a heavy, iron door shut against a raging flood. She did not begin with a tentative greeting. She did not ask if I was healthy, if I was happy, or if I had a spare moment to talk. She bypassed basic human decency entirely and launched straight into a clinical, rapid-fire damage report. Sabrina had been in a catastrophic car collision on the interstate late Friday night. The road was slick from a heavy autumn downpour. The car had hydroplaned, and she had wrapped her expensive luxury sedan around a concrete pillar at a horrifying speed. She had survived the initial impact, but she was currently lying in a sterile intensive care unit, trapped in a profound, unresponsive coma. My mother recited the terrifying medical terminology with a chilling detachment, detailing severe traumatic brain injury and incredibly grim neurological prognoses, as if she were reading a quarterly financial loss statement. I stood frozen in my warm kitchen, the scent of searing butter turning suddenly nauseating. I felt absolutely nothing for the woman bleeding out in a hospital bed 2,000 miles away. There was no sudden rush of sisterly affection, no panicked urge to leap onto an airplane. I merely listened to the cold, hard facts of gravity catching up to a woman who had spent her entire 38 years believing she could float above the consequences of her own reckless actions. But the catastrophic news did not stop with the accident. The crash was merely the initial tremor before the earthquake. My mother forced out a ragged breath and continued outlining the cascading collateral damage. Avery was completely buckling under the weight of the crisis. She was now solely responsible for a 4-year-old daughter named Wren. Furthermore, Avery was currently drowning in a sudden, massive influx of overwhelming medical debts, severe mortgage delinquencies, and a highly aggressive impending lawsuit that was actively threatening to liquidate the family's remaining core assets. The financial structures Sabrina had supposedly managed with flawless brilliance were rapidly collapsing like a house of cards in a hurricane. To compound the structural failure, My father was entirely incapacitated. He had suffered a transient ischemic attack, a mild stroke, just 2 weeks prior. He was currently weak, heavily medicated, completely stripped of his usual passive authority, and physically incapable of managing the extensive real estate investment portfolio that held the family wealth together. The fortress was falling. The untouchable Mitchell family was bleeding out on multiple fronts. And then came the absolute pinnacle of their collective audacity. My mother stopped detailing the wreckage, her breathing shallow and ragged over the speaker. She delivered the demand with the blunt, unforgiving force of a physical blow. She stated, without a single shred of hesitation, that I needed to return to Portland immediately. She mandated that I take a leave of absence from whatever little job I was doing in Chicago and come back for at least a few months to stabilize the properties, handle the aggressive creditors, and fix the monumental mess my sister had left behind. A sharp, cold laugh involuntarily escaped my throat. It was a harsh, metallic sound that startled even me. I gripped the edge of the marble counter so hard, my knuckles turned a stark, bone white. For exactly 60 months, I had existed as a complete phantom to these people. For 1,825 days, my phone had not rung with a single birthday wish. There had been no holiday cards forwarded to my office, no desperate, tearful voicemails begging for my forgiveness, and absolutely zero inquiries into whether I was even alive. They had comfortably, selfishly buried me alive because my absence was the required cost of their perfect, delusional happiness. Now, the exact second their golden child became a massive liability, the moment the money stopped flowing and the legal threats started circling, I was suddenly, magically reinstated as a vital member of the family ecosystem. I was no longer the collateral damage. I was the designated emergency generator. I opened my mouth to tell her to hire a forensic accountant, to call a bankruptcy lawyer, and to lose my number permanently. Before I could form the syllables, my mother instantly recognized the lethal drop in the ambient temperature of my silence. She aggressively pivoted her strategy. She completely abandoned the financial angle and shamelessly weaponized the only thing she knew I could not effortlessly dismiss. She brought up the child. She emphasized, her voice cracking with a perfectly calculated emotional tremor, that Wren was a completely innocent 4-year-old girl who did not deserve to lose her home. She painted a pathetic, desperate picture of Avery, claiming she was so mentally and emotionally shattered that she simply could not physically cope with the impending ruin alone. My jaw locked. The sheer, blinding hypocrisy was staggering. They had literally engineered the conception of that child using my stolen future, my carefully selected donor, and my own money, and now they were using her existence as a heavy moral anchor to drag me back into their sinking ship. My finger hovered aggressively over the red icon to terminate the call. I was done. I had heard enough. But just as my skin brushed the glass screen, my mother uttered a single sentence that paralyzed my hand completely. The frantic, commanding edge vanished entirely from her voice, replaced by a dark, heavy, and deeply unsettling certainty. She whispered the words slowly. "It is not just about signing the bank paperwork or organizing the trust money. Quinn, Avery specifically wants you to come home." The 2 words struck the center of my chest with the precise, agonizing accuracy of a sniper's bullet. Come home. The phrase echoed in the silent space of my kitchen like a resurrected, highly contagious disease. It was the ultimate, grotesque manipulation. I stared directly at Noelle. She had already turned off the stove. She was leaning against the far counter, her arms crossed securely over her chest, watching my face with an intense, analytical focus. She did not look worried. She looked like an investigator watching a prime suspect walk willingly into a complex interrogation room. The sheer absurdity of the request was completely eclipsed by the glaring, massive inconsistencies hidden within it. Avery wanting me back did not make logical sense. Avery was a coward who had happily let me be completely erased from her narrative. For my mother to deploy Avery's supposed longing as the ultimate bait meant the situation was far more desperate than unpaid mortgages or a simple car crash. It meant they were terrified. I did not agree to return out of a suppressed, lingering love for the woman who betrayed me. I certainly did not agree out of some pathetic, misguided sense of familial duty to the parents who threw me away. I agreed to keep listening solely because my deeply ingrained professional instincts, honed by years of dismantling corporate lies, began screaming loudly in the back of my mind. There was a massive, gaping hole in the narrative my mother was desperately trying to sell me. The math simply did not add up. People do not suddenly summon their exiled, discarded scapegoat just to act as a temporary nanny and a bookkeeper. They summon the scapegoat when they urgently need a legally binding signature, a massive infusion of clean capital, or a convenient, credible target to take the fall when the authorities finally arrive. I took a very slow, deep breath, stabilizing my heart rate, and told my mother to send me the preliminary legal files. I would review the documents tonight. I did not promise to save them, but I was suddenly intensely motivated to find out exactly what kind of dirty, rotting secrets they were trying to bury beneath my sister's hospital bed. My mother's voice crackled through the phone's speaker, dropping an octave into a hushed, conspiratorial register. She bypassed any further medical updates and began to detail the absolute freefall of Avery's daily existence. Without Sabrina's massive corporate income acting as a sturdy safety net, Avery's boutique freelance design business had completely evaporated. The lucrative client list had vanished over the past few months, replaced by a towering mountain of past due notices, aggressive collection calls, and final foreclosure warnings. My mother described Avery wandering through their sprawling, expensive house at all hours of the night, entirely unmoored, heavily medicated on various anxiety prescriptions, and completely incapable of executing basic, everyday functions. And then there was Wren. The 4-year-old girl was allegedly having severe night terrors, constantly tugging at Avery's sleeves, asking over and over again why Mama Sab would not wake up and come home. My mother painted this bleak, devastating portrait with the precise, calculated strokes of a seasoned artist, clearly expecting my deeply ingrained childhood instinct to fix broken things to automatically kick into high gear. I listened to the tragic monologue without offering a single murmur of sympathy. I was completely immune to her performative sorrow. But then the narrative took a sharp, entirely grotesque turn. My mother let out a heavy manufactured sigh and stated that Avery desperately needed someone exceptionally reliable to step in and permanently stabilize the household. She paused, letting the heavy silence hang in the air, before adding that Avery specifically believed that person should be me. I genuinely thought the digital connection had garbled her words. I pressed the phone closer to my ear, demanding she repeat herself. She did not hesitate. My mother elaborated, her tone shifting into a sickeningly sweet, persuasive cadence, claiming that Avery felt no one understood the intricate, complex dynamics of our family better than I did. She actually had the sheer, unadulterated gall to say that Wren had reached a critical developmental age where she desperately required a disciplined adult presence in the house. The sheer depravity of the request hit me with the unforgiving force of a freight train. It took every ounce of my rigorously practiced self-control not to hurl the phone across the kitchen island. After my sister systematically stole my fiancé, hijacked my meticulously planned journey into motherhood, and successfully engineered my complete excommunication from the family unit, they were now facing the catastrophic collapse of their stolen happily ever after. Because Sabrina was lying completely motionless in a hospital bed, permanently off script and utterly useless to them, they literally wanted to draft me to step back into the very life they had violently ripped from my hands. They did not want a prodigal daughter to return for a heartwarming, tearful reunion. They wanted a highly functional, emotionally detached living patch to seamlessly cover the gaping hole my sister had left behind. They wanted me to move into their house, pay their mounting bills, manage their endless crises, and raise the child that was biologically supposed to be mine, all while playing the role of the benevolent, endlessly forgiving aunt. It was a staggering level of psychological entitlement. They viewed my entire existence as a fully stocked supply closet they could just pry open whenever their own reckless choices caused a catastrophic shortage. When I remained dead silent, refusing to offer the immediate, unconditional compliance she expected, my mother swiftly escalated her tactics to blatant, aggressive moral extortion. She rapidly fired off a relentless barrage of guilt-inducing scenarios, painting a picture so devastating it felt completely rehearsed. She weaponized an innocent 4-year-old child who was currently losing her mother's, framing Ren's profound confusion as a direct result of my stubborn absence. She weaponized my sister's grim terminal medical prognosis, heavily implying that holding on to old grudges was incredibly petty in the face of imminent death. She weaponized my father's sudden, convenient physical frailty, noting that his mild stroke left him completely unable to shield the family from the impending legal slaughter. She passionately argued that the core family assets, the very foundation of the Mitchell legacy, were at severe risk of being completely liquidated by aggressive, unforgiving creditors. Furthermore, she claimed our once pristine family reputation in the city was being actively suffocated under the crushing weight of impending public scandals. She deliberately framed my immediate return not as a personal choice, but as an absolute, undeniable ethical obligation that any decent human being would instantly accept. And when the heavy moral bludgeon failed to elicit a response, she smoothly transitioned to the financial bait. My mother suddenly adopted the brisk, transactional tone of a seasoned corporate negotiator. She began casually dropping references to the family trust fund, explicitly mentioning that my designated percentages had remained entirely untouched. She dangled lucrative shares in the commercial real estate portfolio. She even had the audacity to suggest that my father's final will had always preserved a substantial portion of the estate specifically for me, speaking as if a massive, unexpected influx of capital could magically wave away 5 years of absolute, agonizing erasure. She spoke as if my brutal exile was nothing more than a minor, unfortunate administrative error that could be easily rectified with a generous wire transfer and a revised legal addendum. I let her finish pitching her grotesque, highly manipulative offer. I waited until her frantic breathing steadied over the speaker. Then, I cut through the suffocating web of her lies with a single razor-sharp question. My voice was entirely devoid of emotion, cold and hard as polished steel. "Tell me the absolute truth," I demanded, articulating every single syllable with lethal precision. "Does Avery actually want me to come back to help raise her daughter? Or does she just desperately need me to resume my designated role as the most easily sacrificed person in that entire house?" The reaction on the other end of the line was absolute, deafening silence. It was not a brief pause to gather her thoughts. It was a profound, terrifying void. In that prolonged, heavy emptiness, the ugly, undeniable truth was completely exposed. My mother could not formulate a lie fast enough to cover the staggering accuracy of my accusation. In that exact fraction of a second, I understood with total, crystalline clarity that this phone call had absolutely nothing to do with familial reconciliation. It was an emergency conscription. It was a desperate, calculated deployment of emotional resources, squarely targeting the one person they had already successfully destroyed once before, simply because they knew I was strong enough to survive the wreckage they could no longer manage. I did not wait for her to stammer out a pathetic defense. I delivered a flat, unequivocal refusal right then and there. I told her I would absolutely not be packing my bags. I would not be moving into their haunted house, and I would certainly not be acting as Avery's emotional or financial savior. However, instead of immediately terminating the call and permanently blocking the number as I had successfully done half a decade ago, I made a highly calculated tactical decision. I told her I would review the legal and financial documents she mentioned, purely out of morbid curiosity regarding the extent of the damage. I kept the digital door cracked open just a fraction of an inch. My sharpest survival instincts, honed by years of analyzing corporate fraud, were practically screaming at me that the convoluted story she was desperately trying to sell was missing massive, crucial components. The situation was infinitely messier, dirtier, and far more dangerous than she was willing to admit. I finally pressed the button to end the call, placing the phone face down on the marble counter. The kitchen was overwhelmingly quiet. the jazz music having faded out minutes ago. Noelle was still standing there, leaning against the far counter. She had listened to my half of the conversation with unwavering, intense focus. She did not rush over to pull me into a comforting embrace. She did not ask me how I was feeling, and she absolutely did not ask if I was secretly contemplating forgiving the people who had shattered my life. Noelle operated on logic, data, and cold hard facts. She knew exactly how to dismantle a narrative and find the rotting wood underneath the fresh paint. She reached out, picked up her heavy crystal glass of red wine, and took a slow, deliberate sip. Her dark eyes locked onto mine, incredibly sharp and entirely devoid of useless sentimentality. She did not view my family as a tragic emotional puzzle. She viewed them as a highly suspicious data set with glaring inconsistencies. "Did you happen to notice?" Noelle asked, her voice calm, measured, and terrifyingly perceptive. "That your mother just spent 20 minutes meticulously describing the exact, intricate mechanics of their impending financial ruin, but she barely spent 30 seconds actually detailing your sister's severe medical condition. I booked a brief, highly restricted flight back to the Pacific Northwest. I explicitly informed my mother that I would be returning for exactly 48 hours, officially stating that my sole purpose was to review and physically sign the complex medical power of attorney documents she had strategically mentioned during our phone call. I recognized the paperwork for exactly what it was: a crude, desperate liability trap, carefully designed to legally tether me to my sister's failing physical state. I walked straight into that trap anyway, entirely on my own terms, purely to gain unrestricted access to the epicenter of their collapse. Noelle flew across the country with me, though we maintained a strict, highly calculated operational separation. She checked into a discreet boutique hotel downtown, instantly transforming a standard king suite into a highly efficient data command center. While I stepped onto the battlefield to play the role of the prodigal daughter, Noelle remained safely out of sight, quietly and aggressively mining public county records. She was systematically pulling property deeds, scanning for pending civil lawsuits, reviewing outstanding mortgage liens, and cross-referencing every single piece of corporate registry information tied to my sister's legal name. We were no longer treating my family as a unit of relatives. We were treating them exactly like a highly suspicious, hostile corporate entity under investigation. The moment I turned the brass doorknob and stepped into my parents' sprawling colonial house, a visceral, suffocating wave of muscle memory washed over me. The air was thick with the exact same expensive vanilla and sandalwood candles my mother had burned for decades, a cloying scent designed to mask whatever tension vibrated beneath the floorboards. I walked slowly through the grand foyer and into the formal living room, my eyes immediately drawn to the massive stone fireplace. The mantel was meticulously lined with silver and crystal photo frames. I scanned the smiling faces, noting with a cold, clinical detachment that my physical existence had been thoroughly and systematically excised from the family history. There were countless photos of Sabrina's law school graduation, my parents' anniversary trips, and Avery holding a newborn baby, but there was not a single image containing my face. The absolute lack of shame in the room was palpable. They had not just replaced me, they had smoothly edited the timeline so that my departure appeared to be nothing more than a natural, highly convenient evolution of their perfect lives. I found Wren sitting quietly on the floor of the sunroom. She was a strikingly observant 4-year-old girl with dark, intelligent eyes and a mop of curly hair. She was not crying, throwing a tantrum, or begging for her mother's the way my own mother had dramatically claimed on the phone. Instead, Wren was deeply engrossed in assembling a highly complex wooden model of a naval ship, carefully fitting tiny, intricate pieces together with intense concentration. She looked up at me, offered a polite, surprisingly formal greeting, and then immediately went back to her task. Looking at her, I felt absolutely zero resentment. She was a remarkably bright, steady child, completely untainted by the toxic soil from which she had been grown. She was not the agonizing tool of guilt the adults in this house were actively trying to weaponize against me. She was simply a little girl trying to build a boat in a house that was rapidly sinking. Then, I heard soft footsteps against the hardwood floor. I turned around and saw Avery standing in the doorway. The physical toll of the last few weeks was undeniable. Avery had lost a significant amount of weight, her expensive silk blouse hanging loosely off her fragile collarbones. Deep, bruised shadows circled her eyes, painting a stark portrait of absolute exhaustion. Yet, even buried under layers of crushing stress, she still possessed that soft, gravitational, deeply helpless charm that had once convinced me she was the safest person in the world. She stared at me from across the room, her breath catching audibly in her throat. She looked at me exactly the way a drowning sailor looks at a ghost ship suddenly appearing through thick fog. She walked toward me, her steps hesitant. Our first conversation in half a decade was devoid of any dramatic apologies or tearful confessions of lingering romantic love. Avery simply wrapped her arms tightly around her own torso, looked down at the floor, and began speaking in fragmented, half-finished sentences. "I did not know if you would actually come," Avery whispered, her voice incredibly fragile. "Everything is so loud right now. Quinn, the lawyers, the doctors, the banks. It is just constant noise." She finally lifted her eyes to meet mine, delivering a line so profoundly manipulative it made the hairs on my arms stand up. "You were always the one who made things feel safe. Whenever you were here, the ground just stopped shaking." I stared back at her, feeling a terrifying, icy realization slide perfectly into place. Avery was not standing here pining for the romantic partner she had brutally discarded. She did not love me anymore, and perhaps she never truly had. What she loved, what she missed with a desperate, agonizing hunger, was my pure, unadulterated utility. She still fundamentally believed, down to her very marrow, that I was put on this earth specifically to carry the hardest, heaviest parts of her life. She wanted me to build the fortress, reinforce the walls, and stand guard at the gate so she could comfortably resume her soft, unbothered existence inside. I did not offer her a comforting smile or a reassuring promise. I simply told her I needed to go to the hospital to review the paperwork, leaving her standing alone in the silent sunroom. The intensive care unit was a blindingly bright, sterile labyrinth of beeping monitors and the sharp scent of antiseptic. I stood at the foot of Sabrina's bed, my hands shoved deeply into the pockets of my wool coat. My sister lay completely motionless beneath a thin white blanket. A thick plastic ventilator tube was taped securely to her mouth, forcing her chest to rise and fall in a harsh mechanical rhythm. Despite the violent trauma of the car crash, her face had somehow been entirely spared. Her cheekbones were still sharp, her skin completely unblemished, her features resting in an absurdly perfect, serene mask. It was a cruel biological joke. For the very first time in 5 years, as I looked down at the woman who had ruthlessly orchestrated the absolute destruction of my future, I felt absolutely no hatred. The burning, acidic rage that had fueled my escape to Chicago was entirely gone. In its place was a cold, profound emptiness. I was merely looking at a bill that had finally come due. I was looking at the staggering, catastrophic price of a life lived entirely without boundaries. A life where no one had ever forced her to pay for the damage she caused. I stayed in the room for exactly 10 minutes, analyzing the medical charts clipped to the end of the bed, before turning on my heel and walking out. As I navigated the quiet, winding corridors toward the elevator bank, I paused near a dimly lit emergency stairwell. The heavy metal door was propped open a fraction of an inch, and the sharp, frantic hiss of hushed voices echoed into the hallway. I instantly recognized my mother's voice, vibrating with a level of raw, unfiltered panic she had completely successfully hidden during our phone call. The second voice belonged to an older man, carrying the distinct, tired cadence of the longtime family attorney. I pressed my back against the cool plaster wall, holding my breath, and listened carefully to the fragmented argument bleeding through the crack in the door. "You have to stall the forensic audit," my mother hissed, her tone desperate and aggressive. "If they look closely at the secondary escrow account before the end of the fiscal quarter, they are going to see exactly what she did." "I cannot stall a federal inquiry." "Helen," the lawyer shot back, his voice thick with sheer exasperation. "The primary developers on that coastal condotel project are officially filing for bankruptcy on Monday morning. The capital your daughter supposedly secured for the construction phases simply is not there. The money is entirely gone. If the bank connects the unauthorized transfers back to the family trust, we are no longer looking at a simple breach of contract. We are looking at a massive multi-million-dollar loan fraud investigation." "Then find a way to isolate it," my mother demanded ruthlessly. "Blame the administrative shell companies. Blame the independent contractors. Do whatever you have to do to ensure this does not attach to my husband's primary assets." I stepped away from the wall, my heart hammering a slow, heavy, incredibly steady rhythm against my ribs. I walked quietly into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. The pieces of the puzzle slammed violently together in my mind, forming a terrifyingly clear picture. The catastrophic car crash on the rain-slicked highway was merely a surface wound. It was a highly convenient distraction. What my family was truly terrified of was not Sabrina dying. They were absolutely paralyzed by the structural financial collapse she had engineered while she was alive. Sabrina had not just mismanaged her corporate firm. She had meticulously built a massive, fraudulent house of cards, using the family's pristine reputation as collateral. She had left behind a ticking time bomb, and the timer was rapidly approaching zero. They did not summon me home to hold Avery's hand or to read bedtime stories to a 4-year-old. They summoned me because they desperately needed a spotless, highly competent name to sign on the dotted line right before the explosion leveled them all. I returned to Noelle's discreet downtown hotel room, carrying a heavy leather briefcase stuffed with the exact documents my mother had confidently handed me. She had presented the thick stacks of paper under the pathetic guise of necessary medical proxy preparations, fully expecting me to simply skim the highlighted sections and blindly sign my name on the dotted lines, exactly as the obedient, dutiful daughter used to do. She completely forgot that my entire professional career in corporate operations was meticulously built on rigorous risk mitigation, forensic contract analysis, and a ruthless, unforgiving habit of hunting down hidden liabilities. I spread the chaotic pile of ledgers, bank statements, and dense legal agreements across the large mahogany desk. I did not read them with the anxious, clouded eyes of a grieving sister. I read them with the cold, precise, and entirely detached focus of an auditor examining a hostile entity. It took me less than 45 minutes to realize that absolutely none of the numbers matched. The first glaring anomaly surfaced in the corporate registration filings. Sabrina had established a boutique legal and real estate consulting firm named Westmere Advisory Group. The official paperwork proudly listed both my sister and my former fiancé as the principal partners. However, the operational capital flowing through the firm's ledgers did not originate from legitimate client retainers or their own personal investments. Instead, I tracked massive, highly irregular personal transactions being actively routed directly through a primary checking account that was legally linked to my parents. Sitting cross-legged on the crisp white hotel bed, bathed in the pale blue glow of her laptop screen, Noelle quietly began pulling public state registry data and cross-referencing my physical findings. Within 2 hours, she had successfully mapped out a dizzying, incredibly incestuous web of shell-limited liability companies. These phantom entities existed purely on paper, yet they were continuously buying and selling 3 specific commercial properties that already belonged to our family's core portfolio. With each internal transaction, they artificially inflated the appraisal values, leveraging the newly manufactured equity to illegally secure massive, high-interest lines of credit from oblivious regional banks. And every single cent of that freshly laundered money was being siphoned directly into a catastrophic, entirely failed coastal development project my sister had foolishly guaranteed. But the absolute sharpest piece of glass, the discovery that genuinely made the blood run freezing cold in my veins, was buried near the bottom of a secondary file regarding a commercial loan extension. I spotted a digital signature authorization form. My eyes instantly locked onto the timestamp printed neatly in the top right corner. It was dated exactly 4 months after I had packed my bags, abandoned my townhouse, and driven away to Chicago. Yet, sitting right there on the final page, proudly occupying the primary guarantor line, was my exact electronic signature. My immaculate credit score, my spotless financial history, and my completely clean legal name had been hijacked. They had intentionally kept me alive on their financial paperwork to secure crucial capital they otherwise never would have qualified to receive. I had absolutely not signed a single legal document since the morning I broke my wedding lease. That meant either my signature had been blatantly forged by a family member, or my sensitive personal information had been weaponized without my consent to commit federal loan fraud. I shoved the forged document into my wool coat pocket, left Noelle analyzing the remaining corporate structures, and drove straight back to the suffocating colonial house. I found Avery standing alone in the massive kitchen, brewing a cup of chamomile tea with badly trembling hands. The house was dead quiet, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I walked directly up to the marble island, pulled the crumpled loan extension from my pocket, and slammed it flat onto the counter right in front of her. Avery flinched violently, spilling hot water over the rim of her ceramic mug. She looked down at the paper, then looked up at my face. When I demanded a clear, unequivocal explanation for why my name was aggressively tethered to a fraudulent corporate loan, pure, unadulterated panic completely consumed her features. Her breath hitched, and the familiar, pathetic tears immediately began to well up in her eyes. She swore blindly, her voice cracking in a desperate, high-pitched plea that she knew absolutely nothing about the complex corporate structuring. She frantically claimed that Sabrina and my parents strictly handled every single financial decision behind closed doors. She insisted, pressing her trembling hands against her chest, that she only ever signed the dotted lines when she was explicitly told it was standard family business. She looked at me with those wide, terrified eyes, desperately begging me to see her as a helpless passenger in a car someone else had deliberately driven off a cliff. But looking at her terrified, tear-stained face, my last remaining shred of pity entirely evaporated into the cold Portland air. I no longer possessed a single ounce of tolerance for people who gladly sleep in expensive houses, wear designer clothes, and reap the luxurious, comfortable rewards of a deeply fraudulent system, only to suddenly claim the role of the innocent, ignorant victim the exact second that system inevitably detonates. Being easily manipulated did not absolve her of actively participating in the feast. I turned my back on her without uttering another word and drove back to the hotel, feeling a dark, heavy knot of pure disgust tightening in my stomach. I sat back down at the mahogany desk and forced myself to dig even deeper into Westmere's earliest ledgers, pulling bank statements from the exact month my entire life had imploded. That was when I uncovered a detail so profoundly painful, so breathtakingly cruel, that it physically knocked the breath out of my lungs. It was a specific line item originating from a joint savings account Avery and I had previously shared. It was the heavily protected fund we had meticulously built over 2 entire years, sacrificing vacations and luxury purchases to pay entirely in cash for our impending in vitro fertilization process. I looked at the withdrawal date. The entire balance, amounting to tens of thousands of dollars, had been completely liquidated exactly 48 hours after I walked out of their lives. I traced the routing numbers with a shaking finger. The stolen money was not used to pay off a sudden mortgage deficit or settle a pressing legal debt. It was directly transferred, in full, into the specialized billing department of the exact same fertility clinic they had visited. The staggering, monstrous cruelty of the transaction paralyzed me in my chair. They had not merely stolen my fiancé behind my back. They had not simply hijacked my deeply personal dream of motherhood. They had literally reached into my bank account and used my own hard-earned money to finance the initial medical procedures that created the child meant to permanently replace me. The grueling labor I had endured at my firm had literally paid for the biological foundation of their treacherous, stolen family. I had unwittingly financed my own execution. The sheer toxicity of the discovery was completely suffocating. The air in the hotel room felt impossibly thin. I started furiously packing the ledgers and bank statements back into my leather briefcase. I was entirely done playing the quiet detective. I was fully prepared to march out the door, book a one-way, first-class ticket back to the Midwest on the very next available flight, and happily hand every single scrap of paper over to the district attorney's office. Let the federal investigators completely obliterate them all. Let the banks seize the sprawling house. Let the entire Mitchell legacy burn to ash. But right as I aggressively zipped the heavy leather bag shut, Noelle spoke up from the bed. Her voice was uncharacteristically tense, entirely lacking its usual calm, detached cadence. She slowly turned her laptop screen toward me. While I had been confronting Avery and uncovering the stolen fertility funds, Noelle had spent the late afternoon utilizing a secure back channel to aggressively monitor the hospital's digital registry logs. "Quinn," Noelle said, her dark eyes locking onto mine with a sharp, dangerous intensity. "Do not get on an airplane just yet." She pointed a steady finger at a highlighted line of code glaring on her screen. Someone operating from an administrative computer terminal located directly inside the intensive care unit had just attempted to forcefully access and illegally alter the primary medical power of attorney files. They were actively, desperately trying to digitally force my name onto the proxy guarantor line. The message was terrifyingly clear. If my sister did not wake up, they were not just planning to beg for my help. They were quietly, maliciously maneuvering behind the scenes to ensure I would be legally, inescapably bound to sign away the collateral for federal crimes I did not commit. They were actively building my cage while I was standing right inside their house. The rain lashed violently against the expansive glass windows of the kitchen. I stood motionless by the marble island, staring at the woman who was once the center of my meticulously planned universe. This sprawling house, purchased with laundered family funds and the liquidated remnants of my own savings, was supposed to represent a domestic sanctuary. Standing here now, listening to the heavy storm outside, it felt exactly like a beautifully decorated, suffocating tomb. It was the exact kitchen where I was supposed to have lived as a devoted partner. Standing over the same counters, brewing coffee in a completely different timeline, I cornered Avery right there in the dim, cold light of the recessed fixtures. There was nowhere left for her to run, no domineering mother to hide behind, no comatose partner to violently shield her from the brutal glare of reality. I demanded the entire, unvarnished truth. I told her in a voice devoid of any warmth that I would absolutely not listen to another carefully rehearsed excuse or watch another performative, manipulative display of tears. I wanted the rotting anatomy of the betrayal laid bare. Avery gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning bone white against the dark stone. Stripped of her usual soft, protective aura, she finally cracked under the immense atmospheric pressure I brought into the room. She confessed that in the very beginning, she was completely, hopelessly intoxicated by my sister's reckless gravity. My life was governed by strict routines, calculated risks, and unyielding professional discipline. Sabrina, conversely, was a hurricane of absolute chaos, thrilling danger, and blinding attention, Avery admitted, her voice trembling with the weight of the confession, that Sabrina made her feel entirely seen in a way my quiet, steady stability never did. My sister possessed a terrifying magnetic talent for taking something incredibly ugly, something fundamentally taboo, and repackaging it to look like a grand, unavoidable destiny. When the clinic confirmed the medical procedure was successful, Avery whispered, her voice barely rising above the rhythmic drumming of the pouring rain. When I realized I was actually carrying the baby we had painstakingly planned together, I completely panicked. The crushing reality of what we had done finally set in. I wanted to come to you immediately. I wanted to confess everything before the wedding invitations ever went out in the mail. I asked her what stopped her, though my highly analytical mind had already deduced the grand architecture of their collective cowardice. Avery swallowed hard, her tired eyes glued to the polished stone surface. She explained that my mother and Sabrina had immediately intervened, forming an impenetrable, highly aggressive psychological wall. They explicitly told Avery that my moral compass was far too rigid to ever accept the situation. They convinced her that because I lived my life entirely by strict, unforgiving principles, I would instantly destroy the entire family structure, publicly ruin their professional reputations, and leave Avery completely destitute and utterly alone with a newborn child. They deliberately painted my personal integrity not as a virtue, but as a highly dangerous, volatile weapon that needed to be permanently neutralized through a coordinated ambush. The air in the room grew suffocatingly heavy. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, cutting through the physical distance between us. "That explains the specific night you conspired to shatter my life," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level, entirely devoid of any shouting. "But it absolutely does not explain the 1,825 days that followed. Why did you never once attempt to find me? Why did you comfortably let me become a complete ghost?" Avery looked up, her expression a haunting mixture of profound exhaustion and deep, agonizing shame. She described living inside a beautifully gilded, incredibly restrictive cage. The exact moment I drove away to the Midwest, Sabrina rapidly consolidated absolute control over every single aspect of their shared existence. My sister held the property deeds, managed the highly secretive bank accounts, and ruthlessly dictated the legal frameworks of their daily lives. Avery was entirely financially dependent, effectively trapped in a luxurious lifestyle built entirely on stolen, fraudulent capital. Furthermore, Sabrina relentlessly drilled a highly specific, toxic narrative into Avery's mind, day after day, year after year. She constantly reminded Avery that I was a cold, ruthless operator who would absolutely never, under any circumstances, forgive a betrayal of that staggering magnitude. I flatly refused to accept the pathetic, tired narrative of the helpless maiden. I stared directly into her tear-filled eyes and dismantled her fragile defense with a single, uncompromising truth. Being highly susceptible to relentless psychological manipulation does not magically erase your own free agency. It absolutely does not absolve you of the cold, hard fact that you actively, willingly participated in pushing me out of my own life. You chose the comfortable, well-funded lie over the difficult truth every single morning you woke up in this stolen house. Avery flinched violently, exactly as if I had physically struck her across the face. She did not attempt to argue the point. Instead, she reached deep into the pocket of her oversized wool cardigan and pulled out a small, encrypted digital storage drive. She placed it carefully on the marble counter, pushing it slowly across the smooth surface until it rested right in front of my hands. "You are absolutely right," Avery said, her voice dropping to a harsh, ragged whisper. "I am a profound coward, but that is precisely why I desperately needed you to see the financial documents tonight. I did not ask your mother to call you because I was delusional enough to think we could ever fall back in love. I asked her to call you because of what Sabrina was actively doing right before the crash on the highway." I stared down at the small metal drive, a sickening, icy premonition twisting sharply in my gut. I demanded to know exactly what was hidden on it. Avery took a shaky, uneven breath, finally delivering the devastating piece of intelligence that completely shattered the remaining illusions of my family's sudden panic. Weeks before the rain-slicked collision, the fraudulent real estate development began to officially, catastrophically collapse. Aggressive creditors were actively circling the properties, and federal banking regulators were beginning to ask highly specific, incredibly dangerous questions regarding the missing funds. Sabrina knew the explosion was imminent. In a desperate, entirely malicious attempt to insulate herself and my parents from the impending criminal fallout, she had begun drafting incredibly complex legal maneuvers. She was preparing to legally transfer a massive portion of the toxic corporate debt and the federal liability directly onto the dormant financial accounts that were still attached to your Social Security number, Avery confessed, tears finally spilling heavily over her eyelashes, completely unforced and grounded in pure terror. The sheer, breathtaking evil of the strategy forced me to grip the edge of the counter just to remain standing upright. My family was not merely going to let me live peacefully in my Midwestern exile. Even if I had never answered the phone on that Sunday evening, even if I had never stepped foot back in the Pacific Northwest, they were actively preparing to drag my perfectly clean name into the burning wreckage. They were meticulously constructing a false narrative where the absent, estranged daughter was the secret, mastermind architect of the financial fraud, intending to use me as a human shield to absorb the catastrophic impact of their own unbridled greed. Avery looked at me with a raw, agonizing clarity that I had not seen in half a decade. I wanted you to know the absolute truth before your mother and the estate lawyer successfully turned you into the designated sacrificial lamb for the second time. I could not stand by and let them bury you alive again. The kitchen fell entirely silent, saved only for the relentless drumming of the heavy storm against the thick glass. For the very first time in 5 years, Avery had executed an undeniably decent, profoundly selfless action. She had willingly handed me the exact, highly classified ammunition required to destroy the powerful people who controlled her entire life, purely to protect me from being framed for a federal crime. It was a staggering moment of clarity, a genuine act of remorse that actually carried a massive, dangerous cost for her own survival. It made me pause, the rigid, icy armor around my chest cracking just a fraction of an inch. But while the gesture was incredibly significant, it arrived exactly 5 years too late to resurrect the dead. It could not magically heal the massive, rotting wounds between us, but it fundamentally altered the entire tactical landscape of the brutal war I was now fighting. Before I could even reach out to pick up the encrypted digital drive, the harsh, shrill ringing of Avery's cell phone violently shattered the heavy silence. Avery jumped, hastily swiping the illuminated screen to answer the late-night call. I watched the remaining color drain completely from her face as she listened to the urgent voice on the other end of the line. Her posture went entirely rigid, her eyes widening in absolute shock. She ended the call and slowly lowered the device to her side, her eyes locking onto mine with an expression of sheer, unadulterated terror. The hospital had just called from the intensive care unit. For the very first time in several agonizing weeks, my sister had exhibited a definitive, spontaneous neurological reaction. The attending doctors were officially altering her grim prognosis. If she actually woke up from the coma, she would be the only person alive who knew exactly where the missing millions had been buried. And the exact moment she opened her eyes, the entire fragile house of cards we were currently standing in would violently detonate. The immediate, terrifying possibility that my sister might actually wake up and regain her cognitive functions acted like a violent chemical catalyst within the walls of my parents' colonial house. By the time the sun rose the following morning, the atmosphere had shifted so drastically it gave me whiplash. The pathetic, weeping, desperately fragile matriarch who had begged for my help on the phone completely vanished. In her place stood the ruthless, calculating architect of the Mitchell family facade. My mother cornered me in the grand hallway right before breakfast, her posture rigid, her eyes flashing with a hostile, territorial glare. She did not ask how I was holding up. Instead, she pointed a manicured finger at my chest and demanded, in a harsh, low whisper, that I stop digging through the family files immediately and absolutely not make a fuss right now. Her golden child was exhibiting neurological activity, and that meant the narrative was rapidly shifting back into her iron grip. Before noon, the longtime family attorney arrived at the estate carrying a thick leather briefcase. He ushered me into the formal dining room, offering a practiced, sympathetic smile that did not reach his cold eyes. He slid a dense stack of heavily flagged documents across the polished mahogany table, casually describing them as routine, temporary protective measures. He smoothly claimed that since Sabrina was hovering in a precarious medical limbo, they desperately needed me to sign these temporary proxies to safeguard the family assets from aggressive creditors in case she lost permanent capacity. I did not blindly reach for the expensive silver pen he offered. I opened the folder and read the fine print with the precise, unforgiving scrutiny of a seasoned project auditor. It took me less than 5 minutes to spot the buried clauses. The paperwork was not a temporary administrative proxy at all. It was a beautifully disguised, legally binding guillotine. Signing those documents would instantly, irrevocably tie my name as the primary executive guarantor to the exact chain of fraudulent shell companies currently under federal investigation. They were actively trying to hand me the steering wheel of a car that was already accelerating off a cliff. I closed the folder, pushed it back across the table, and walked out of the room without uttering a single word, leaving the lawyer sitting in stunned, humiliated silence. I found my father sitting alone in his dark, wood-paneled study. The recent mild stroke had physically hollowed him out, leaving him a shaking, gray shadow of the imposing man who used to dictate my childhood. I stood in the doorway and confronted him about the forged electronic signatures I had discovered the day before. He did not yell. He did not attempt to deny it. He just looked down at his trembling, liver-spotted hands and let out a long, ragged breath. In a voice barely louder than a whisper, he finally confessed. He admitted he had personally authorized Sabrina to use my clean Social Security number and spotless credit profile for a handful of initial corporate transactions right after I left for Chicago. He weakly claimed he only allowed it because he genuinely thought Sabrina was brilliant, that she would quickly flip the properties, pay the money back, and he could easily explain it to me later if I ever found out. But the debt had rapidly spiraled entirely out of control, and by the time he realized the massive scale of her fraud, he was in far too deep to stop her. Staring at his broken, weeping figure, the deepest, most pathetic tragedy of my entire life suddenly clicked into perfect focus. My father was not a calculated, malicious predator like my mother or my sister. He was simply a profound coward. His desperate, agonizing weakness and his relentless refusal to ever hold Sabrina accountable was the exact fertile soil where all their magnificent, destructive sins had eagerly taken root and flourished. Later that afternoon, while I was packing my briefcase in the guest bedroom, Wren wandered in holding a battered, cracked tablet. She looked up at me with those wide, innocent eyes and politely asked if I could fix her puzzle game, which had completely frozen on the screen. I took the device, forced a hard reboot, and began navigating through the system settings to clear the corrupted cache. As the operating system refreshed, a hidden folder of highly compressed, synchronized audio files suddenly populated on the screen. The files were automatically pulled from the shared family cloud network. One specific file was dated just 6 months prior. Driven by a cold, sharp instinct, I tapped the screen and pressed play. The chilling, metallic timbre of my sister's voice filled the quiet bedroom, followed immediately by my mother's hushed tones. It was a secret recording of a heated argument. They were intensely debating the impending collapse of the coastal condotel project. My mother sounded frantic, asking what they were supposed to do if the federal banking regulators froze the primary escrow accounts. Sabrina laughed. It was a cruel, arrogant, terrifying sound. She calmly instructed my mother to keep the entire financial mess strictly contained and to absolutely keep me out of it until the exact moment they needed a clean target. They explicitly discussed my physical absence not as a tragic family rift, but as a highly convenient, fully funded legal and moral contingency plan. The audio file was the definitive, undeniable proof that they had never once viewed me as a deeply wounded relative. To them, I was nothing more than a designated human shield waiting in the dark to absorb their bullets. I immediately forwarded the audio file to Noelle and drove straight to her downtown hotel. I found her pacing the length of her room, her phone pressed tightly to her ear. When she hung up, her expression was incredibly grim. She had just finished speaking with an anonymous, highly placed source inside the district attorney's office. The federal investigation into the loan fraud was moving at a terrifying breakneck speed. The regulators had found the missing capital, or rather, they had found the massive craters where the capital used to be. Noelle warned me that if I did not officially, legally amputate myself from their toxic corporate structures within the next 48 hours, the prosecutors were going to officially subpoena me as a primary co-conspirator. The clock had completely run out. Exactly an hour later, Avery arrived at the hotel suite. She looked completely shattered, a woman who had finally stopped running from the monster chasing her and decided to turn around and hand it the knife. She walked in carrying a heavy, reinforced cardboard box. Without a single word of hesitation, she dumped the contents onto the hotel bed. She had brought everything. She handed over stacks of printed, highly incriminating emails between Sabrina and the shell company directors. She surrendered the original, itemized billing receipts from the fertility clinic, proving my stolen funds were used to finance her pregnancy. She provided printed transcripts of vicious, calculating text messages between Sabrina and my mother. Avery fully understood that handing over this mountain of evidence would completely, permanently destroy whatever fragile remnants of her family still existed. She knew it would leave her bankrupt and utterly exposed, but she gave it to me anyway, accepting the devastating consequences of her own cowardice. Noelle and I spent the next 3 hours frantically organizing the physical evidence, preparing to submit a massive preemptive defense package directly to my own independent legal counsel. We were building an impenetrable fortress of data to prove my innocence. Just as I was zipping up the leather portfolio to leave, my phone vibrated sharply on the desk. The caller ID displayed an unknown number, but I recognized the prefix from the intensive care unit. I answered it immediately. It was the sympathetic floor nurse I had quietly spoken to during my previous visit. The nurse spoke in a rushed, frantic whisper. Sabrina had briefly regained consciousness just 10 minutes ago. She was awake for less than 2 minutes in total. She could not move her limbs or open her eyes fully, but she had managed to pull her oxygen mask down just a fraction of an inch. My mother had leaned in close to hear her. The nurse, standing right beside the vital monitors, heard the raspy, broken words perfectly. Sabrina did not ask about her daughter. She did not ask about Avery. She did not ask what happened to her car. She had looked at my mother and breathed a single, desperate command. Do not let Quinn get the addendum. I slowly lowered the phone, staring blankly at the hotel wall as the final, massive piece of the puzzle violently locked into place. The addendum, a hidden, supplemental legal contract. The evidence Avery brought was incredibly damning, but it was all circumstantial. That hidden addendum was the smoking gun. It was the exact piece of paper that would definitively prove exactly who orchestrated the massive fraud, and exactly who had legally designed the trap to push the entire federal sentence onto me. And right now, it was the only thing standing between my complete freedom and their total annihilation. I did not sign a single piece of paper. I did not entertain the frantic, manipulative phone calls from my mother, and I completely ignored the threatening emails sent by the longtime family attorney. Instead of returning to the suffocating colonial house to play the obedient, sacrificial daughter, I walked directly into the sleek, glass-walled offices of the most ruthless, highly respected independent corporate litigation firm in downtown Portland. I paid a massive retainer fee using my own clean corporate salary and immediately instructed my new legal team to file an emergency injunction. We submitted formal, legally binding declarations to freeze every single financial account that carried even a trace of my name. Simultaneously, we dispatched official, aggressive legal notices to the regional banking executives, completely denying the validity of any electronic signature attached to my identity after the specific month I had broken my wedding lease and relocated to the Midwest. Operating out of the quiet sanctuary of the boutique hotel room, Noelle and I spent the next 48 hours constructing an airtight, devastatingly precise data timeline. We mapped out the entire anatomy of the betrayal with surgical accuracy. We documented the exact calendar day I packed my suitcases and drove away. We cross-referenced that departure date with the exact morning my electronic signature was illegally cloned and authorized on the corporate registry. We highlighted the precise hour the in vitro fertilization fund was completely drained from my joint savings account. We then charted the rapid, subsequent incorporation dates of the fraudulent shell companies, creating a flawless visual chain of evidence connecting their stolen seed money to the massive influx of illegal loan capital. I did not gather this mountain of evidence to stage a dramatic, tearful family intervention. I gathered it for the authorities. I walked into the district attorney's office alongside my lead counsel and handed over the heavy binders. We surrendered the pristine audio recording, the thick stacks of incriminating emails Avery had provided, the vicious text messages, and the undeniable proof of the signature forgery directly to the lead financial investigators. I did not execute this strike out of a burning, uncontrollable emotional desire for petty revenge. I did it with the cold, calculated precision of a project manager cutting the structural chords of a collapsing bridge, purely to ensure their massive sinking ship could not drag me down into the freezing depths with them. The response from the federal regulators was immediate and absolutely catastrophic for the Mitchell family. When the investigators officially subpoenaed the remaining financial records and backed my mother entirely into a legal corner, her ironclad, aristocratic facade finally shattered. Sitting under the harsh fluorescent lights of an interrogation room, she confessed. She admitted to the prosecutors that she was the primary force who relentlessly pushed Sabrina to keep my name actively tethered to the corporate documents. She stated, her voice stripped of all its former power, that she did it because my background was always completely spotless, and the banks would blindly trust my immaculate credit score to approve the massive capital loans. The revelation completely broke whatever fragile spirit remained inside my father. When the investigators played the secret audio recording for him, forcing him to listen to his own wife and his golden child coldly plotting to use me as a disposable legal shield, his cowardly silence finally ended. For the very first time in my entire existence, he actually stood up and protected me. He signed a comprehensive, legally binding sworn affidavit confirming that I had been completely estranged for 5 years, asserting that I possessed absolutely zero knowledge of the financial transactions they had executed in my absence. Avery then bravely took the witness stand during the preliminary grand jury hearings. She officially testified, cementing her statement on the permanent public record that Sabrina had explicitly mapped out the contingency plan. Avery quoted Sabrina stating that if the real estate venture ever imploded, I would be the absolute most logical person to shoulder the heavy federal blame simply because I always lived my life with such suffocating responsibility. That single, devastating sentence instantly transformed a messy, complicated family dispute into a crystal-clear, premeditated criminal motive in the eyes of the law. They had weaponized my inherent integrity against me. The final, fatal nail in the coffin was hammered home when federal agents executed a massive search warrant at the lavish Westmere Advisory corporate office. Deep inside a locked, fireproof steel safe, the investigators finally uncovered the missing piece of the puzzle. It was the secret addendum. It was a fully drafted, highly illegal legal mechanism designed to automatically transfer all the catastrophic contingent liabilities directly onto the dormant accounts still tied to my Social Security number. The margins of the thick paper were completely covered in handwritten revision notes, penned in the distinct, matching handwriting of both my sister and my mother. It was the ultimate, undeniable proof of their conspiracy. The legal and financial results were swift, brutal, and utterly devastating. My name was completely and permanently scrubbed from every single fraudulent binding. The federal investigation pivoted entirely away from me, locking its massive crosshairs directly onto the criminal syndicate coordinated by Sabrina and my mother. The government immediately froze their primary banking accounts and seized their lucrative investment portfolios. The sprawling, beautifully decorated family home was officially repossessed by the bank and forced into a rapid public auction, their pristine, untouchable reputation among the city elite completely evaporated overnight. They lost absolutely everything in the exact same silent, agonizing way they had once tried to throw me away. I met Avery one final time in the gray, rain-washed concrete parking lot of the hospital. The heavy Portland clouds hung low overhead. I reached into my coat pocket and handed her a crisp white business card for a highly reputable family law attorney. I calmly explained that I had already paid a substantial preliminary retainer fee strictly to ensure that Wren would not be legally or financially abandoned during the impending criminal trials and bankruptcy proceedings. However, I looked Avery directly in the eyes and made my boundaries terrifyingly clear. I told her that my charity ended right there on the wet asphalt. I would absolutely not step in to play the role of the substitute mother. I would never be her romantic partner again, and I was officially retiring my lifelong position as the designated moral savior for anyone in that cursed bloodline. I turned around and walked away without waiting for her response, getting into the passenger seat of the waiting rental car where Noelle sat quietly behind the wheel. As we merged onto the highway, driving toward the airport to leave the Pacific Northwest behind forever, I felt a profound, incredible lightness in my chest. I had successfully reclaimed the absolute totality of my identity. Looking out the window at the passing pine trees, I finally understood the profound truth about true justice. The deepest, most satisfying retribution was not watching them drop to their knees and beg for my forgiveness. The ultimate punishment was simply taking my life back and forcing them to finally live the rest of their natural lives in a cold, unforgiving world where I was no longer standing there to save them. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please leave a comment letting me know where you are listening to this story from so we can interact and share our thoughts. I invite you to subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support it further by pressing the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.